Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvellous video. Dragons are the most enigmatic of all the magical monsters in The Lord of the Rings. While widespread in most folklore traditions, these fascinating creatures have an inexplicable origin story in Middle-earth. Morgoth, the very first Dark Lord, is widely thought to have formed them as his principal servants, although what they had been before that is unknown. There are just a few recognized dragons in the story, which is generally due to their relevance to the plot, although many of them have thrived from the beginning of time. The first ones did not have the ability to fly, which was supposedly developed much later, consequently making these powerful creatures more dangerous than before. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origin and development of dragons in Tolkien's lore. Dragons, sometimes also called the Great Worms, were malevolent monsters found mostly in northern Middle-earth. They were hungry, crafty, beguiling, and wicked, and were most likely a corruption formed by Morgoth using fire and magic sometime during the First Age. Morgoth understood that orcs alone would not be enough to vanquish his opponents after witnessing the power of the Noldor in combat. As a result, he began to spawn a new class of creatures known as the dragons. Glarung, a gigantic worm with a dreadful mind and a strong, mesmerizing stare, was the father of dragons. Glarung was crucial to the future of all the children of Húrin. Among his numerous crimes were the annihilation of the elf realm named Nargothrond, and also the casting of a spell on Ninor that erased all of her memories. This ultimately led to her catastrophic reunion and wedding to her long-lost brother Turin. Ninor threw herself unto her death when she discovered the truth about Glaurung's wicked scheme. Glarung was eventually killed by Turin, who later committed suicide in response to the dragon's evil scheme. Morgoth brought a new evil to Middle-earth at the time of the War of Wrath, namely the Flying Dragons. And Calagon the Black was the most notable of all of them, and Calagon's descent destroyed Thangorodrim's towers before he was murdered by Erendil the Mariner. Many dragons were destroyed during the War of Wrath, but others fled and thrived into the following ages. They appear to have fled to the lands of the Northern Waste, very far away from the realms of elves and men. Over the millennia, the dragon race continued to reproduce and repopulate, notably in the region of the Withered Heath, a place located between two peaks of the foggy grey mountains. Dragons, along with orcs, were a menace to the existence of men during the Third and Second Ages. In the later parts of the Third Age, the wicked dragons who resided in the Withered Heath, roused by the revival of all darkness with the return of the one enemy, started to torment the Northmen and wage war on the dwarves about the year of TA 2570, and Dane I and all of Durin's folk had been murdered by a giant cold drake in the year 2589. Dragons may have devoured 4 of all the 7 mysterious dwarf rings during these conflicts. Smaug the Terrible, the most deadly dragon in the Third Age, destroyed the dwarf realm or the land of Erebor and the surrounding village of Dale. This ruined the land and drove Durin's folk into complete and total exile. For many years, the fire drake stayed in the deserted halls of the Lonely Mountain. Soon after, the wizard Gandalf grew anxious that the evil Dark Lord Sauron might gain the allegiance of the wicked and powerful dragon Smaug and use him to wreck the northern parts of Middle-earth. To avoid such a connection, he sponsored and backed Thorin and company's mission and their burglar, who was none other than the hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. This started a series of events that ultimately led to Smaugs Death as a result of the crafty bard, the Bowman. Even though Smaug was the largest dragon of his time, he doesn't appear to be the last of his kind, as Gandalf told Frodo Baggins that there is not yet any dragon left on this world in which the ancient fire is fierce enough to ever melt the rings of power, implying the existence of other, weaker dragons. Some of the key characteristics in the dragons of Lord of the Rings. The dragons were massive and almost immortal, living for centuries. They shared a desire for riches, in particular gold, had a delicate intellect, sharp, cunning, and great physical prowess. Their gaze and words possessed a mesmerizing power known as the dragon spell. Those who were skilled enough to resist the enchantment never gave clear information, instead spoke in riddles, because just refusing to answer would attract an immediate attack. Dragons, it appears, hatched from eggs. It's possible that dragons also had horns. While all dragons were armored with extremely strong iron scales, they also had a soft place behind their armor, around their chest, that could be punctured by swords or darts. Some dragons, such as Glarung, crawled like snakes while standing on their 4 strong legs like a tetrapodophysis. Because winged fire dragons only emerged during the destructive War of Wrath, and cold drakes, who had wings and are only mentioned in Turambar and the Folalok, must have been the most prevalent form of dragon in the First Age. Smaug and Calagon, for example, could walk on all 4 legs and also fly using their wings. Wingless dragons also did exist during the time of the Middle Ages and survived into later ages as well. The Urloki, or in singular terms the Urlok, also known as the fire drakes, could breathe out bursts of fire. It's unclear if the word Urloki applied exclusively only to the early dragons, such as Glarung, who could spew out fire from their breath but lacked wings, or to any dragon who could breathe fire, including Smaug. The dragon fire of the mysterious Urloki was actually powerful and hot enough to melt even the rings of power, and 4 of the powerful 7 rings given to the dwarves were devoured by this very same dragon fire, even though it was not destructive enough to damage the 1 ring itself. Cold drakes were dragons that couldn't breathe fire. Those were mostly found in Ered Mithrin. Looking back at some of the memorable dragons in Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien's detailed legendarium of Middle-earth includes dragons that are heavily based on European legend, but with identities that are their own. For instance, the cunning Smaug, who possesses characteristics of both the Beowulf dragon as well as Fafnir. Tolkien's depiction of the dragons in his fantasy tales have been used in games modelled on his Middle-earth literature as well as by other fiction writers. The Book of Lost Tales already has dragons in its storyline. Tolkien has been interested in dragons since he was a youngster. He also named them Drake, from Old English draka, which came from the Latin word draco, and also worm, which comes from the Old English word worm, which means serpent or dragon. In his novels about Middle-earth, Tolkien identified merely 4 dragons. They, in a very similar fashion to the Old Norse dragon named Fafnir, can talk and are capable of sophisticated and detailed communication. Morgoth, who's named Melkor here, deploys mechanized war machines in the guise of dragons against the town in the earliest manuscripts of the text of The Fall of Gondolin, the lost tale that serves as the foundation for the Silmarillion. A few of these dragons also act as modes of transportation for the orcs. These do not exist in Christopher Tolkien's modified Silmarillion, in which actual dragons assault the city. Morgoth had not yet invented the flying dragons during the moment at the fall of Gondolin, as in the later legendarium notion of dragons, and Calagon the Black evolved alongside the earliest flying dragons. Dragons lived in the areas of the Northern Waste as well as Withered Heath at the north of the Misty Grey Mountains during the late Third Age. In his Middle-earth novels, Tolkien only identified 4 dragons. Another story, Chrysophylax Dives, may be found in the Farmer Giles of Ham, which is not part of the Middle-earth corpus. Chrysophylax also is a powerful fire-breathing dragon who has been defined as cunning, probing, hungry, well-armed, but not overly brave. Glarung was one of the very first dragons in existence and also was one of Morgoth's most trusted allies at the time of the First Age. He possessed 4 legs and a flaming breath, but he couldn't fly since he lacked wings. He was intelligent and could actually communicate and comprehend words and language. It's unknown when Glarung was born, but he first appeared in Angband in the year of FA 260, at the time of the siege of Angband. Despite the fact that he was still quite young in dragon terms and hadn't yet reached full power, his initial attack drove the Noldor to the Ered Wethrin and Dorthonion from the Ard Galen, which he captured and corrupted. This triumph, however, was very short-lived, as Glarung was pushed back to Angband by Fingon, the Valiant, who was an elf from the land of Noldor, who rode against him accompanied by a troop of mounted archers. Morgoth was furious that Glarung had shown himself while he was still so young, and for the next 200 years forbade any more expeditions from Angband. The assault of Angband was completed in the year FA 455, during the fight of Sudden Flame in the Daegor Bragolak. Glarung, who was now fully grown, commanded the biggest army of orcs and balrogs ever mustered against the Noldor Leaguer, and conquered it. He then advanced on the people of Fëanor, defeating a force of their horsemen on the plains of Lothlan and striking Maglor's Gap and burning all the area between Gillion's arms. The counterattack occurred in the year of FA 472, during the time the Union of Maedhros advanced in force towards Angband in the final confrontation at the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, also known as the Unnumbered Tears. Glarung and his clan entered the combat in the wee hours on the third morning as Morgoth unleashed his last power against the united armies of Turgon, Fingon, and Maedhros. However, the dwarves of Belgost, with their massive battle masks, held him off. Glarung, who was then surrounded and hacked at by their sharp axes, flew into a wild frenzy and slaughtered Asgal, who was the lord of Belgost. But with his final blow, the dwarf lord gave Glarung a mortal wound to the belly, and the dragon and all of his offspring fled back to the land of Angband, handing the resounding win over the powerful Union to Gothmog as well as his Balrogs. Glarung commanded a large number of orcs against the elven underground fortress of Nargothrond in the fall of the year 495 FA. He travelled across Anfauglith and initially attacked Sirian's northern vales. Then came south and annihilated Ithel Ivrin, as well as Talath Durnan. Mormagil Turin Turambar led the soldiers of Nargothrond out in order to meet Glarung at the Battle of Tumhalad, halting his advance. The elves were absolutely and completely beaten. Their ruler, King Orodreth, was killed, and when Turin sought to collect the survivors for a final defense of Nargothrond, the wicked and powerful Glarung arrived first. The dragons sped across the bridge across Narog, destroying the famed doors of Felagund. Turin came as Glaurung's vicious orcs were storming the city and made his way toward the hostages that were being held captive. Then Glaurung talked to Turin and persuaded him to go back to Dor Lomin, which was a region of Hithlum during the First Age, and save his mother named Morwen and his sister Ninor, rather than pursue Finduilas, when in fact they already had made their way to Doriath. He drove away all the orcs after spinning the first thread of his scheme to bring disaster to the offspring of Hurin, whom Morgoth had cursed, and took his dwelling in Nargothrond, throwing apart the bridge and sleeping on the enormous wealth he had looted in true dragon manner. Glaurung's sleep was interrupted the next year, which was FA 496. When news of the downfall of Nargothrond reached Doriath, a small group led by Morwen and Ninor was dispatched to gather information, particularly about the fate of Turin. His sharp vision instantly discovered them, and as they got near his home, he rushed into the Narog, creating a cloud of smoke and reek that confused and baffled the spies. Glarung then moved rapidly into Amon Ethir, where he saw Ninor alone and cast the same spell on her as he did on her brother Turin. Instead of subtle deceptions, he utilized his power to fully erase Ninor's memories and abandon her in the wilderness. Glarung went on to rule as the majestic Dragon King of what was formerly the realm of Nargothrond for the next few years, attracting many orcs to him. Meanwhile, Ninor had escaped Mablung's custody and had strayed into Brethil. Turin was the one who found her, as she was now living among the Helithrim, and the people she lived with called her Niniel. The two fell madly in love and married, having no idea that they were brother and sister, as Turin had never even met his sister, and even Niniel was unaware of her actual identity. Glarung started sending his orcs against the men of Brethil in the year FA 498, forcing Turin to expose himself. He returned the next summer, but was ambushed before reaching the Helithrim's houses at Efel Brandir. Turin waited in the canyon of Kebet and Aras, and so as Glarung prepared to leap over it, Gurthang, which was the name of Turin's black blade, gave him a fatal blow. Even as he struggled to breathe on the banks of the river Teiglin, the deceiver finished the fate he had fashioned for the children of Hurin. Turin was knocked unconscious by Glaurung's toxic blood, and Niniel, who arrived on the scene, mistook him for dead. The dragon disclosed his scheme with his dying breath, and as he died, his magic was undone, allowing Ninor Niniel to restore her memories. In desperation, she jumped to her demise into Kebed and Aras, and then, when Turin awakened and learnt of the tale from Brandir, he flung himself onto his own sword. Glaurung's brood joined him inside the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, and after his death were there at the time of the fall of Gondolin. By that time, they had grown many and horrible. It's unknown what this brood was comprised of, and by consequence, what Tolkien envisioned Glaurung's connection with the other dragons to be. The labels, Father of the Dragons as well as First of the Uroloki, were similarly dubious in regards to whether Glaurung is an ancestor or just the first to be formed. His brood might be all following dragons, only one subspecies, or just his direct children. There is certainly an argument to be made whether Calagon and the winged dragons were independent creations of Morgoth. On the other side, the sole two named flying dragons, Smaug and Calagon, were both Urloki, which meant that they breathed fire. There aren't any other dragons specifically mentioned to be exactly like Glarung, both who were fire-breathing but also not flying, making it impossible to establish from Tolkien's published writings that he meant Glaurung's progeny to represent a distinct lineage. In the end, all we know about Tolkien's conception of dragon taxonomy comes from isolated allusions to distinct sorts like Urloki, cold drake, and also longworms. Therefore, the problem is unlikely to have a canonical explanation. Calagon. Calagon the Black was indeed the deadliest of all of Morgoth's dragons, and the most powerful flying fire dragon that ever lived. At the time of the War of Wrath, all of the Valar fought their ultimate battle against Morgoth. Their triumph was near, with the majority of the powerful Dark Lord's Balrogs as well as other forces slaughtered. However, in the year 587, Morgoth released the winged dragons that he'd been harboring in Angband, and Calagon was one among them, and their onslaught pushed back the armies of the host of the Majestic Valar, who had come with bolts of lightning and firestorms. By the later parts of the Third Age, Gandalf had referenced Calagon, remarking that no amount of his burning fire could damage the One Ring. Calagon is originally a name in Sindarin. It is not glossed fully, but it comprises Ankh, which means jaws, and its root Alak, which means rushing. It is translated as biting storm in the Noldorin term of the Elvish language, from Ankh, meaning row of teeth or jaw, and Alagos, which means storm of wind. Calagon is referred to as Andraka in Eriol's adaptations in Old English, and this meant enemy dragon. The earliest appearance of Calagon in the detailed legendarium by Tolkien was in the text of Quenta Noldorinwa in the 1930s, which presents a version of the Grand War of Wrath that is even more simplified than the one provided above, while the tale does not alter from subsequent versions. Tolkien never finished the Quenta Silmarillion, therefore the material concerning Calagon was never elaborated, and although he altered the material of the War of Wrath, the revisions were extremely brief, done in the book named Quenta Silmarillion from the year 1937, and the Quenta Silmarillion published later in the year 1951. This was the primary material used by the author Christopher Tolkien in his version of the Silmarillion. The sole reference to Calagon in subsequent literature is in a remark regarding the Haladin language, made in Tolkien's final years. Christopher Tolkien notes that this prophecy is consistent with the many interpretations of the elaborate end-of-the-world predictions, since his father always referred to the cataclysmic event as the last battle. However, he also points out that the phrase last conflict is definitely used to denote the battle at the conclusion of the Elder Days in the precise essay from where this passage is taken, despite the fact that in all prior works it is Eärendil who defeats Calagon during the War of Wrath. Christopher notes that Turin murdering Calagon in Andreth's prophecy is similar to Sigurd killing Midgard Somra in the Voluspa, particularly in his father's recounting in the New Lay of the Volsungs. Scatha. Scatha, the worm, was a gigantic long worm who resided in the Grey Mountains and was also one of the largest dragons to infiltrate that area in the north. Scatha's life is little known, except that he owned a vast fortune plundered from the dwarves. In the early stages of the Eothiod, he was assassinated by a man named Fram, who was the son of Frumgar. His rediscovered wealth was the source of much contention between all of the men who were of the Eothiad, as well as the dwarves who resided in that region, both of whom claimed ownership of the trove. Fram refuted their claim and delivered them the dragon's teeth, saying, "Jewels similar to these you would not equal in your coffers, for they are difficult to come by." It was said that the dwarves murdered him because of this insult. Fram's people appear to have kept at least a portion of the trove, which all transported south with them when they settled in Rohan. The Horn of the Mug, which Éowyn presented to Merry Brandybug just after the War of the Ring hundreds of years later, was claimed to have originated from Scatha's trove. Scatha appears in a flashback describing the origins of Fram and also the Eothiod. He assaulted Framsburg and mutilated Frumgar's sword arm, prompting Fram to swear vengeance and seek Scatha for 2 years. In the current day, the player discovers the remaining of Scatha's wealth, which Fram was not able to take with him. Smaug. Smaug was the Third Age's most powerful fire-breathing dragon. He invaded the gloomy areas of the Lonely Mountain and also the settlement of Dale in the year of TA 2770. He took the mountain's riches for himself and drove Thror, king beneath the mountain, and all of his people into exile. Thorin's quest to regain the riches with the assistance of his thief Bilbo Baggins was successful when Smaug was killed by Bard in the year TA 2941. After Bilbo Baggins first confronts Smaug, he notices his snoring, but is most startled by the reddish light and heat that Smaug emits, both of which reach up the passageway such that Smaug's presence is felt much before he's even seen. His flames are scarlet and green. Perhaps Smaug was one of the major dragons that invaded the Grey Mountains. His origins are unclear, although he was evidently still considered young by Gandalf as well as himself when he first emerged in Middle-earth's lore in the year of TA 2770 that described him as ancient and powerful when he reached the age of the year TA 2941. This implies that he was either young or not even alive at the time of the War of the Dragons and Dwarves. Nevertheless, he, like many others, would hear about Erebor's wealth and splendor. Smaug traveled south like a cyclone that came from the north after learning of the riches of the strong dwarves of Erebor and invaded the affluent dwarven realm which spread across the Lonely Mountain and its surrounding regions. He initially perched on the peak, then came down the slippery slopes and set fire to the forests. When the dwarves came running out through the front gate, Smaug slew them all just before turning his focus to the men of Dale, murdering most of their warriors, which included Girion, Lord of Dale. However, his child and wife safely fled to the lake town. When he returned to the mountains, he crept through the main gate, leaving no dwarf alive. Only Thror, king beneath the mountain, and his son Thrain II were able to escape via the secret side door, to which Thror later gave Thrain the key to the hidden entrance as well as a plot of the Lonely Mountain. Thorin Oakenshield was among the very few dwarves that were not within the mountain during the time when the attack occurred. Smaug seized the wealth, which also included the Arkenstone as well as a mithril coat that he claimed for himself and laid down on a bed of gold for the following 2 centuries, only leaving the mountain on rare occasions to take people, particularly maidens, and continue the devastation of Dale. The area around the mountain was known by the name of the Desolation of the Powerful Dragon because there was neither shrub nor tree, and only shattered and charred stumps to testify of ones long departed. In the year TA 2850, while snooping on the mighty necromancer in the land of Dol Guldur, Gandalf discovered a dwarf imprisoned. Approaching death, the dwarf offered Gandalf a key as well as a map. Unknown to Gandalf during this time, this dwarf was known by the name Thrain, who was one of the king of Durin's folk, all of whom had been taken by the powerful necromancer in the year TA 2845. Gandalf was exceedingly worried about the weakened position of the North after discovering that the mighty necromancer was actually Sauron, but he was most anxious about Smaug and Sauron. He was well aware that maybe if Sauron could gain Smaug's loyalty, he would be able to utilize the dragon for his horrible schemes. For this reason, the Grey Pilgrim devised a strategy to neutralize the dragon's menace, robbing the Dark Lord of the prospect of acquiring a powerful minion while also limiting the Dark Lord's developing authority in the northern territories of Middle-earth. Gandalf and Thorin Oakenshield met by happenstance in Bree on March 15th, 2941, although one source states that they first met when Thorin overpowered Gandalf, but began to talk to him on the road. They talked about how they wanted to defeat Smaug and regain the Lonely Mountain, and they subsequently convened in Thorin's halls near the area of the Blue Mountains to devise a strategy. Gandalf intended for Thorin to bring the hobbit named Bilbo Baggins as a thief on their journey to reclaim Erebor, which took some convincing. Later, in the year TA 2941, at Bilbo Baggins' house, Gandalf gave Thorin the key and the map, and joined them on a part of their journey. Later that year, on Durin's Day, the party arrived at the summit. They put Bilbo in through the hidden door to fulfill his job as their thief. While Smaug slept, fantasizing of greed and fury, Bilbo took a hefty 2-handed goblet from the dragon's huge treasure hoard, which he proceeded to use as a bed, and then returned to the dwarves. Smaug sensed a breeze from the tunnel leading to the secret entrance as he awoke, from which he'd already heard untoward knocking. Smaug was already suspicious when he discovered the cup was stolen. This infuriated Smaug beyond measure, forcing him to exit his chamber and explore the hillside for the intruder, despite the fact that he had no practical purpose for the cup. Recalling hearing weird noises from the passageway, he failed to discover the entry, only eating their horses. Remembering his father's adage, each worm has a vulnerable place, Bilbo promised to go back to the dragon's cave, which the dwarves eagerly accepted, and off he went, wearing the ring. Bilbo assumed that the beast was deep asleep and also that his appearance would go unnoticed by the monster. Instead, Smaug was actually pretending to be sleeping. But Bilbo was more astute than Smaug acknowledged him to be. Bilbo lauded the dragon while ensuring that he did not divulge his true name, talking only in riddles. Smaug couldn't help but be fascinated by what Bilbo had said, though he reminded him that adulation would not ever save his life and he needed to comprehend it, so they proceeded to converse. He was also curious to smell something new, perplexed by the never-before-inhaled hobbit smell. Bilbo got increasingly uneasy in Smaug's company, but mustering his complete bravery and courage, he admitted that he had actually come just for the treasure. Smaug chuckled and derided the concept that anybody could take his precious hoard from him and ever get away with it. Bilbo then informed the great dragon about the true purpose of his mission, the purpose being to take revenge. Smaug exploded into a crushing chuckle, throwing Bilbo onto the floor, ridiculing the idea that anybody might obtain retribution, gloating about his triumphs and strengths. Smaug flipped over and declared that Bilbo's information was wrong and old in response to Bilbo's suggestion that dragons were gentler beneath, particularly in the chest. But while extolling Smaug's jewel-encrusted underbelly, Bilbo saw something essential and exciting. Bilbo had now gotten all the information he needed. He ran quickly up the corridor, leaving behind the dragon enraged by the thought of anyone exacting revenge, and with the hair at the back of his scalp as well as his heels singed off. As Bilbo rushed back to the door, he told the dwarves about his discussion with the dragon while the bird was listening. Smaug took leave of his cave once again and destroyed the mountainside with his powerful tail, locking Thorin and all his men inside the hidden passage. Smaug, determined to attack and destroy the village as a punitive action after realizing that the lake men from the land of Esgaroth must have assisted the intruders, strengthened by Bilbo declaring himself the Barrel Rider. He charged toward it in a fury. The water bodies all around the area became blood red in color, but the wicked Smaug would not go near any of the water, since he was afraid it would make his flames die down. Smaug soared above, attacking and blazing the town aflame, smashing the great house using a stroke of his tail, since the water might quench his flames. The defenders' arrows couldn't penetrate the dragon's scales, but the swift thrush had fled to the town and alerted Bard, a descendant of Girion, who was the Lord of Dale, about the bare patch in Smaug's armor. He was subsequently able to penetrate Smaug by shooting the black arrow squarely into the weakest spot in his left breast. As Smaug dropped, he collided with and destroyed Esgaroth. Following Smaug's demise, Thorin and all of his men claimed the wealth as their birthright. This sparked a feud between Bard and the Elven King of the land of Mirkwood, who each desired a share of the riches as compensation for the massive destruction wrought by Smaug. Thorin refused to distribute the riches, and he had every intention of going to battle with the elves from the land of Mirkwood and the men of the land of Esgaroth to hold on to his title to it. The surprise onslaught by the forces of Bolg, however, pulled the armies of the free citizens of Middle-earth all together during the War of Five Armies. Just after this battle, Bilbo's 13th part of the Troth was entrusted to Bard, who gave it to Lake Town to help in its reconstruction. Following Smaug's death, a fresh Lake Town was constructed farther to the north. Smaug's remains could be observed from the beach, but the inhabitants were constantly afraid of them, and no one dared to wade in the lake to recover the jewels or riches, demonstrating that even in his death, the wicked Smaug still had a frightening presence. Smaug, like the rest of the dragons, loves to amass gold and is characterized by Thorin as perhaps the most unusually hungry, powerful, and evil worm, as proven by his quick detection of the not-so-covertly stolen cup. While he is quick to rage in protection of his own riches, he also demonstrates a sharp and dangerous intellect, as well as a peculiar fascination in guessing and deciphering Bilbo's enigmatic origins, pride and narcissism in his own armor, pomposity in his own indestructibility, which we can see by the fact that he's laughing at the proposal that the dwarves could have their revenge, and the ability to inquire about Bilbo's devotion to the dwarves. Gandalf was concerned about Smaug as a possible friend or accomplice of Sauron because of these attributes, which were supplemented by his devastating strength. Tolkien expressed his disdain for the monster in Beowulf in the letter 122. Instead, he indicated his preference for Fafnir, who was the dragon-like creature from the later Norse interpretations of the Sigurd story. Tolkien said that Smaug owed a lot to Fafnir. Smaug is, in the past tense of the original Germanic word smugen, to push through a hole, derived from the exact same Germanic and Old English origins as smile and schmiegel. It has been speculated that Tolkien was inspired by the Old English term schmieg, which is used to denote a worm. Smaug was also known by the name Priften in a particularly early copy of The Hobbit. Indeed, this text is known by the name The Priften Fragment by John D. Radcliffe. Priften is also a simple Welsh phrase that translates to fireworm. The Great Cold Drake. The dragon named the Great Cold Drake is probably one of the very few ice-based creatures in Middle-earth history, first appearing during the fight against the powerful and bulky grey mountain dwarves. This war lasts over 2 decades, during which multiple dragons, who are also known as the Great Worms, destroy King Dane's residences, with the most formidable of them slaughtering both the monarch and his heir. The dwarves see the Great Cold Drake as a near-invincible foe, similar to Smaug several hundreds of years later, and are compelled to evacuate their native lands to the Iron Hills, as well as Erebor. They survive for a brief time until history strikes its cruel blow once again. Cold drakes were famously rare dragons that couldn't breathe fire. Morgoth was the one who produced and employed the vicious cold drakes during the First Age. Just after the War of Wrath, several cold drakes were discovered in the wastelands north of the Grey Mountains. Their numbers rose throughout the millennia until they were a severe danger to the dwarves who mined in the areas in and surrounding the Grey Mountains in the final decades of the Third Age. Dane I, who was king of Durin's folk along with his second son Thror, was killed at the doors of their palaces by a cold drake in the year TA 2589. The dwarves were convinced to travel eastward from the misty Grey Mountains by the assaults of these terrifying animals, and their domains in the areas of the Iron Hills as well as at Erebor were established shortly after. Cold drakes may be found across Middle-earth's northernmost realms, most notably in the Ered Mithrin, where they serve Hrimel Frostheart, a dragon who ate one of the legendary dwarven rings of power. The cold drake, Vaethug Wintermind, Hrimel's mightiest progeny, was the one who slew King Dane I and his son Thror in the land of Thikkel-Gundu, also known as the Steel Keep, which is also known by the name Dane's Halls. In contrast to Tolkien's cold drakes, who could not spew fire, the cold drakes in the game frequently exude freezing breath. Fire drakes. The fire drakes, also known by the name Uroloki in Quenya, are very powerful and are actually capable of bringing down entire cities on their own. Talking of which, this specific example is linked to the fall of the great city of Gondolin, which at the time was ruled by Queen Elenwe and King Turgon, who were the grandparents of the famous Erendil, and thereby also were the ancestors of Arwen, Elrond, as well as Aragorn. At the time of the fall of Gondolin, a horde of fire drakes fell upon the house of the Noldorin elves, inflicting destruction and forcing its residents to run for their lives. Of course, the threat that they offer is exacerbated by the fact that all of the Balrogs are also members of the enemy army, resulting in the executions of the leaders, as well as a number of the Silmarillion's most important characters, such as Ecthelion of the Fountain, who was an elf lord of Gondolin. The fire drakes were also the more formidable of the two basic subdivisions of dragonkind, with the other being the infamous cold drakes, capable of breathing fire, as the name indicates. Glarung, who was the dragon father, was also the first of his kind. He originally emerged in the midst of the First Age, although the Uroloki were believed to have remained long after the powerful Dark Lord Morgoth was defeated, causing the dwarves to be troubled. At the time of the Elder Days, Calagon the Black was thought to be one of the fire drakes. Bard slayed Smaug, who was famously the last of the genuinely fantastic dragons during the time of the later parts of the Third Age. We can be certain that he was just not the final one of the fire drakes, but Gandalf mentions a few of the fire-breathing dragons approximately 80 years after the time of Smaugs' death, prior to the War of the Ring. Multiple fire drakes are referenced in The Fall of Gondolin, the Legendarium's opening story. Most of the time, it's unclear whether they are distinct from the powerful iron dragons, yet some of them are plainly living creatures, such as the monster of flame with Balrogs atop it, or even the fire drake who drained the mythical fountain of the king. Gostir. Gostir was also one of Morgoth's dragons about whom nothing is known other than its name. In Noldorin, Gostir means dread gaze, derived from the word gost, which means dread or horror, and thir, which means look, face, expression, countenance. Gorsthir was an early spelling of the name. Gostir, also known by the ancient name Dreadglance, was a strong enchanter who lived in the Bal Sirnak mountains, north of Rhûn. He was a pristine white cold drake known for his fearsome appearance and fiery red eyes. With his glance, Gostir could terrify an opponent into submission or even death. However, fortunately for the indigenous Umil, snowmen, and even the Easterling peoples, he mostly preyed on herd animals and huge aquatic creatures found in and all around the Sea of Illuin. The land of Ninqualca, which was also known as Whitefell, a hollow granite spire, was Gostir's home. The stone structure rose like a pretty tough 500-foot obelisk from a large ice field and loomed amidst the frigid mountains of future Bal Sirnak. The primary remains of the once great Iron Mountains was this rocky mountain. Great glaciers ran between the snow-covered peaks north of Rhun and across the eastern limit of the northern waste. These gleaming spires shielded the more balmy coastal taiga to the very east from the severe winds of Forodwaith. Great evergreen woods covered most of the taiga, particularly in the shores and the bays of the vast Sea of Iluin, and served as a perfect hunting paradise for the dragon Gostir the White. Gostir was a classic cold drake in many ways. He hatched years after Thangorodrim's collapse and grew to a height of 60 feet. His thick hide, robust limbs, and large cranium implied immense strength and kept him safe from some of Middle-earth's harsh weather. Huge claws and fangs, as well as a long whip-like tail, served as his weapons of war. Gostir was a competent conjurer, unlike most cold drakes. He preferred incantations and spells above more tangible sources of power. This particular predilection indicated his origins as among one of Morgoth's sly worms, and his later function as a commander of the demon Uruvaiwa, as well as the guardian of the marches of Iluin, which was one of the two lamps of the Valar. The White Drake had nearly perfect control over his territory. His main flaw, despite his comfort and confidence, was complacency. Gostir was also the brother of Lamthang, who was the other child of Muinahelki and Laikaka. He most certainly perished in the War of Wrath, but the people of the Second Age thought he had returned because they confused the frigid worms Inyi Akta as well as his sibling Urere for the legendary Lamthang and Gostir returning. Only in the 1930s, the etymologies that were published in the Chronicles of Middle-earth does Gostir emerge as an official name. In the Legendarium, no official story concerning him was ever given. According to Middle-earth role-playing canon, Gostir was born or hatched just a few years after Thangorodrim's creation, and Lamthang a little while before the War of Wrath. Yet, assuming they were living around the year TA 1640, this seems doubtful. If they were older than Smaug, they would have died a long time before him, because he was the remaining of the mighty dragons and was still regarded relatively young and not quite completely grown when he attacked Erebor. To rectify these issues with chronology as well as the underlying logic of the detailed legendarium on this site, Gostir and Lamthang of the First Age, and also all of the dragons that lived during the Second Age, are treated as separate entities. Tom Bombadil's dragon. In the poem The Horde, there was a character who was named Tom Bombadil, who was an extremely enigmatic and powerful man who lived throughout Arda's history. He dwelt in the plain of the riverbank, which had the Windle at the east of the Shire. Tom, a being shrouded in mystery and lore, resided deep in the ancient woodland among the areas of the Barrow Downs. The elves possessed force and might in their early days, but they eventually succumbed to their demise. During this period, the dwarves feverishly gathered their gold and silver in some kind of a cave, trying to manufacture rings and tokens, yearning for the authority of kings. Tom soon grew old and didn't notice a dragon approaching his cave, and thus the dragon soon killed him and then seized over the great fortune. The dragon also evolved into a protector of the riches, sleeping on top of the treasure for generations. He gradually lost his fire, and his diamonds became glued to his stomach. He slept fantasizing about thieves and devouring them. As he had been doing so, a brave warrior came inside the cave and promptly killed the dragon. Dragons of the War of Wrath. During the various battles of the War of Wrath and up to the time that Morgoth was completely vanquished, the most significant and well-known of all the dragons were, of course, Calagon, Glarung, and also the fire drake of Gondolin. There were indications here and there of one or two additional dragons who aided either of these other great beasts. Thus we incorporate them into this lineup as the Dragon of the War of Wrath, who fought in the wars of Beleriand and Morgoth's last stand. Dragons in the Rings of Power. Dragons are really popular right now. Fire-breathing dragons are ready to take center stage on HBO, where 17 of them will appear in the Game of Thrones spin-off series known by the name The House of the Dragon. They're also the stars of Christopher Paolini's famed Inheritance Cycle series, which will eventually be adapted for Disney+. But there is one fantasy universe that has shown no sign of the huge beasts. Previews for Prime Video's mammoth new Lord of the Rings spin-off series, The Rings of Power, seem to be noticeably dragon-free. We only saw one dragon in the first episode, and there haven't been any more since. There's a reason why this tale of Middle-earth is filled with elves, orcs, humans, as well as half-foots, but lacks the features of the biggest, toughest monsters. In summary, the series is set at the time of the Second Age of the mythical land of Middle-earth, and when we look at it, J.R.R. Tolkien never penned any dragon tales set during that period. Tolkien narrates the story of the first dragons in the Silmarillion, which appeared under the reign of the Dark King Morgoth, who is also known by the name Melkor, early during the First Age. During the Third Age, our Hobbit heroes vanquish Smaug, the final identified dragon in Tolkien canon. But there are several thousand years in between with few dragon legends to talk of, and the incidents present in the Rings of Power take place sometime during that time period. There is also some semi-canonical indication that dragons remained active in making their presence known throughout the Second Age of the land of Middle-earth. After Tolkien's demise, his youngest child, Christopher Tolkien, compiled a book titled The Peoples of Middle-earth that includes new material regarding the flashback sequences and appendices of his father's novels as well as unpublished writings. Tolkien depicts the War of Sauron and the Elves, which occurred during the Second Age in one of his essays of dwarves and men, referring to the orcs who have been reinforced and controlled by followers of Sauron. As Tolkien commentator Michael Martinez pointed out on his blog named the Middle-earth blog, these followers of Sauron may include dragons. Tolkien mentions Sauron slaves without clarifying what they actually are several times throughout his novels and anthologies. But this idea is obviously thin. You'd believe that the author would grab every chance he could to mention dragons. Still, because the final dragon we recognize by name perished during the Third Age, it should imply that others existed during the Second Age, even though they didn't cause enough havoc to enter the history books. So, might Smaug, the dragon, emerge in the second season of The Rings of Power? The giant first appears in Middle-earth history during the tumultuous Third Age, when he attacks the settlement of Dale, as told in Peter Jackson's book The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. He also was already very massive and likely fully matured at the time. Because we've never heard of particular new dragons being born in the Second or Third Ages, it's likely that Smaug or another dragon is lurking in a mountain somewhere during the incidents of the Lord of the Rings of Power. Presumably, our new characters will tread softly when they go exploring. Conclusion. Any lover of the fantastical genre will consider The Lord of the Rings to be one of the greatest examples of high fantastical work. This is especially true given the series' sophisticated perspective on linguistics and culture, history and geography, as well as portrayals of popular fantasy elements such as orcs, elven folk, and even dragons. To the astonishment of any fantasy lover, dragons present in The Lord of the Rings were part of what shaped representation of dragons in other fantasy settings. And, unlike fire-breathing dragons who guarded valuables, dragons present in The Lord of the Rings played a more important part in the context of the entire background and environment of the texts and movies. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.